Hey everybody, welcome back to the Eddie Wilson channel. Today I'd like to start off on a little bit of a different note. This is the first episode that I'm recording since I was on Drew the Catholic's podcast. He was gracious enough to let me tell my reversion story, and now I have 50 more subscribers because of it. So I'd like to welcome those of you who are here with me now and give me a chance and listen to that whole thing. That means a lot to me. And today I'm talking with Brian Keith. How you doing, Brian?
Hey, Eddie, man, thanks for having me on.
So the way that I found you was Kyle Whittington. He runs the Discord, and then that's how I met Drew. And Drew let me on his podcast. So I found your name on there. I was just kind of scrolling through names, and I'm just clicking on random people. So I clicked on your name, and then I clicked on one of your videos, and it was actually your whole story. And I was gripped from beginning to end. And then I had to sign up for your Patreon and send you messages and until you come on here with me. So I'd like to first thank you for doing that. And any words you have to say about Kyle or Drew?
Yeah, I haven't actually had a chance to go into much of the content that they've made. I know more about sort of the work that they're doing behind the scenes, and that's mainly from the Discord group and from a mutual friend that we many of us hold in common. Hallelujah. I'm sure you've probably seen Haley around, and she does just great work behind the scenes. Sort of helping to network and bring people together. And I think Kyle and Drew are doing a good job of creating sort of a network for content creators to sort of help buttress each other up. And I don't know much about the conference that they've put together, but I know that they're putting together, I think, their second conference.
Yeah, second one.
And there seems to be quite a little bit of excitement around that. But yeah, I haven't unfortunately had a chance to consume much of the actual content that they're making.
Well, I'm glad that I found you because I listen to a lot of reversion stories now that I've been back. And I really can't get enough of them because every story that you hear is like a snowflake. It's a unique kind of where they were in their life when they made the conversion or the reversion, what exactly tipped them over, because there's so many different things that could have tipped you over, like life experience tipped you over, or maybe certain reading, or maybe there's a certain person in your life. And yours really stood out to me. I mean, I've listened to hundreds of them now, and I'm really excited to share this with people that maybe haven't heard of you. So what is your channel that you do all your videos?
Yeah, so my channel's called City of the Immaculata. I named it, I guess it was a little bit maybe presumptuous of me to assume that I could name a channel after the work of so great a saint. St. Maximilian Kolbe had a community of Franciscan friars that he formed dedicated to evangelization, specifically through the work of Our Lady. And it's in Polish, it would be called Neokapelanov, which translates to City of the Immaculata. And it kind of started off as a hobby project. In many ways, it still is a hobby project, but it's like ventured into some areas that I didn't necessarily anticipate. The original goal with it was to spend some time presenting all of the Franciscan intellectual tradition that I had been learning and absorbing. And when you turn onto YouTube and you start looking around the Catholic sphere, I've got enough of a pulse on the community to kind of see where most of the attention is laid. And I was like, well, there's a real lack of resources for people that may be interested in this side of the faith. Because there is some unique things about the Franciscan intellectual tradition that you may not find in a more strictly Thomistic, that being the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is much more common to find within at least the intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. So yeah, that's my channel, City of the Immaculata. I've at many times considered just dropping it because it does seem a little bit, I feel a little, like I said, presumptuous at times that I've dared to name my channel that. But at the same time, I think it also helps to keep me in check, because as we're talking about social media here, I think there's a tendency within social media to let certain things kind of get to your head, and it can be a little bit of a bar fight at times, right? It's not the most elegant place in the world, especially if you spend any time on like Twitter or places like this. So by keeping City of the Immaculata at the fore, sometimes when I want to run my mouth about things I should probably not be running my mouth about, I'm like, you know what? I'm a representative of a great saint here, and that kind of keeps me in check and balance a little bit.
That is, I feel like an example of your Catholic showing, because
Hmm.
you're willing to let an outside entity kind of guide where you're going instead of, I'll do this. I'm the judge. I'll decide whether this is good or not. And then if you catch yourself on a bad day, then you put out some bad content that, like me, I think about this as my priest is going to watch it because he's watched most of my episodes and give me feedback on it. So I'm always checking myself in that way. Like Father Jake is going to listen to this probably. I've got to make sure that it's at least representing the church as well as I can, because I'm not educated on it and I haven't been involved as long. So that's another reason why I go to the Knights of Columbus. It's just another check of authority on top of me of
Hmm.
something that I'm brand new at. Like we talked before the podcast, how I'm a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I can kind of go off on my own to a certain extent when I'm on the mats because I've been there for so long and I've learned. It's like if you studied under St. Thomas for 20 years, you have a little bit more leeway of what kind of stuff that you could say. Right now, I don't want to say anything wrong, so I'm always
Hmm.
checking myself against that. And I have somebody like you, who I perceive as an expert in this field. Like I don't even know the differences. If you ask me, what's the difference between Franciscan, Thomistic, Augustinian? I just know they kind of exist,
Hmm.
but I don't even know the basics of them. So before we get into that and say Maximilian, I want to get into a little bit more of your story. Just like I'll provide a link to the episode that I watched of yours that I thought was brilliant. But if you could just give, as much as you want for your story and how you ended up here.
Yeah, so I appreciate that feedback. I don't always get, like personalized feedback from people. I've had some really good response from others, and that tends to be, what I go off of. But it was a very personal thing, and I agree with you. I've benefited much of my life from hearing other people's conversion stories. In fact, one of the first things that I really remember striking me about Catholicism was Scott Hahn's conversion story, which at this point I imagine is probably 30 years old. There was an old tape that used to circulate back in the days of VHS, or excuse me, cassette tapes. And I remember listening to his and just being absorbed with this clearly very intellectual Protestant Presbyterian. And so it's a little vulnerable to put yourself out there like that, right? I didn't realize how much it was. So my own story, I found based on some of the other conversion stories that I had heard, I was like, well, I've never quite heard one like my own. So maybe it's worth taking the time to tell it. And I pretty much I call myself like just a religious sojourner. I wasn't nothing, but I wasn't exactly anything at the same time. So I would just spend all of my time like absorbing all of these religious books and engaging with religious people and trying to sort of eke out some kind of theological, framework that I could live by. And eventually, what happened was I sort of stumbled my way into the Catholic Church as far as reading about it. And at some point, gosh, I guess it would have been about 15, 16 years ago at this point, I discovered actually the writings of Thomas Aquinas and just got absorbed with reading it. And I had like a really deep intellectual conversion. I would say for about 2 years, I was convinced that the Catholic Church was true, but I didn't act upon it. I didn't tell anybody about it. I was just kind of sitting with these books. And, in hindsight, I'm like, gosh, yeah, what is it that compels somebody to actually make these sort of leaps that we make? Because there wasn't the kind of, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there wasn't the kind of resources that we have today with social media where you can just sort of reach out to people or you can watch videos on YouTube. Yet we were still sort of trying to find our way around to the right sources. And then I dealt with a deep, deep family tragedy with my grandmother getting sick and just sort of walking through the process with her of about 2 years of chemotherapy from the lung cancer that she had and just sort of watching her deteriorate and experiencing somebody for the first time in my life, I had experienced somebody that close to me, in my real immediate family, like watching them deteriorate and die, was the sort of impetus for me to make that leap of faith into all of these things that I had been filling my brain with to actually a movement of the will to act upon it. And I come to find out many years later, actually, that that is one of the sort of subtle differences between what we would find in the Franciscan tradition versus the more Thomistic tradition is the sort of emphasis maybe on the intellectual versus the affective yeah, these sort of movements of the will, the will, the primacy of charity and love, and these sorts of things. And it kind of clicked true to me. It kind of rang true. It's like, okay, yeah, no, like we can be intellectually convinced of something. And, I was, like I said, for 2 years, but my grandmother's death was very up close and personal for me. And it was, in many respects, an act of sacrifice, but also an act of love for me to sort of be with her through that entire process. Because as soon as she died, I basically, all of that time that I had spent reading, I immediately went after her death and spoke to a Catholic priest and began the process of RCIA.
That's beautiful. Now I'm remembering why we have such a close connection, because my grandfather was one of the major catalysts. It was actually all four of my grandparents had this kind of effect on me. And my grandfather went first, and he was my hero. And I did the opposite of what you did. I said, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm going to go and I'm going to figure out the answer for myself, because if God was good, he wouldn't have let this happen. So then when my other grandparents died, maybe a decade plus later, and it started to wiggle me back towards where you were headed, where it's like, this can't be it. There's got to be more than this. And then you start reading, and TikTok algorithms are real. Like, if you want good things on TikTok, you can manifest it. You have to scroll past, thumbs down the bad stuff, and the good stuff. Some of these apologetic videos that I was seeing, I never seen them before. So you like one, then another one, then I'm getting bombarded by just all this Catholic TikTok. And you're right. There's so much out there. That all these people, all these characters that have been playing a role. I mean, what you said about Scott Hahn, I think he converted in '86, so that's almost 40 years. And he's been out in the zeitgeist all these decades. He's putting the Bible together. I don't even know about it. Now I got it. And I'm playing all this catch up. And there are so many resources, where to go, who to trust, and these kind of things. And I kind of did that with politics. So I think I have a pretty good eye for who's doing their homework, because that's what I look for. Because that doesn't make you automatically right. But I want to know, if you do your homework, that means you'll look at my side. Because if you want to know the Catholic side, it's a lot of homework. It's a lot of reading. Who are you going to, like, who can you pull from? What century are we talking about? If you don't want to do your homework, then you just say, I don't know. And you twist and you wiggle and you just try not to contradict yourself. I feel like that's what I was doing as an atheist. Any contradiction, you kind of wiggle yourself. You don't plant your flag too firm there. And I feel like that's what agnosticism is. It's just, you'll never get caught, because you're never going to stand too still. You're always going to be moving. And that's what the shifting sand is. And that's what the Bible says. Do the opposite of that. You need a strong foundation. So that was just a rant. If anywhere you want to go with that.
Yeah, one of the things that the priest, when I finally sat down and started talking to a priest, I basically like regurgitated 2 years worth of all this information that I'd been absorbing. I kept trying to like challenge him a little bit, and he always had answers. But at one point he was like, Brian, you've got a lot of really good questions, and there's always more to be known. There's always more to be studied. But he said something that really kind of has always stuck with me. He said, when it comes to something like the Catholic Church, there's really only one question that you need to have answered. And he said, that is, do you believe the Catholic Church is who she says she is? And it's like, if you can answer yes to that, then you need to go ahead and begin the process of RCIA, because it's very clear, that with the Catholic Church, there's like certain exceptions made where, invincible ignorance and these type of things. But it's very clear that if you know that the Catholic Church is true and yet you still willfully refuse to join, then you've got a problem, right? And I sat on that for a little while, and I was like, what, he's absolutely correct. Let me go ahead and start this process of coming into the church, because I actually do. I've been convinced for some time that the Catholic Church was true, and had, really just needed something, apparently like the death of a loved one, to sort of kick me into gear.
What role did your grandmother's faith play in your conversion?
Nobody in my family was particularly religious. With my conversion story, kind of the main point of it was there was a very tragic fire in my family when I was very young that I was involved in. And, my grandmother, I want to say they had been like nominally Baptist for a few years. And I think that just kind of fell away. And then once the fire happened and they lost their son, my uncle, and they lost their my grandfather's mother in the fire as well. My grandfather in particular, he was somewhat combative towards God. Not so much that he didn't believe in God, but I remember having, as a very young boy, having conversations with him because, as a child, you kind of want to believe in something. And my grandfather was just a salt of the earth kind of guy. So I came to him with these like questions that I had about God and religion. And he could be quite stark for my young mind. And I sat with and I still to this day, I think there's legitimate answers to the problem of evil, but when it's a lived experience for someone, right? I have a son, and the reality of losing that son just unimaginable to me, right? And I can't say on the other side of that what my relationship with God would be like. I want to say I know what it would be like. I want to say I would have the faith to preserve to the end, but it was a very deep, and especially since my grandparents, I don't think that they were that deep into the Baptist church to begin with. So my grandmother's got one of her sisters who is actually, she's still alive. She's quite up there in the age now, but very, very devout Baptist. And I know that they had I wasn't privy to the conversations, but I know that this sister had conversations in private when my grandmother was sick about the sort of reality of the afterlife, and I think there was some like touching moments there for my grandmother because on the other side of that, she was much more content with the terminal aspect of her illness. So
That's interesting. My story is a little different because it was an intellectual in a way that I found St. Thomas and I'm like, this is amazing. It was more it was like a last resort. Like I need this Bible to be true to justify what I'm about to do. Like make a big decision, and I used the Bible as a backstop. And once I did that, then I was like, all right, well, who's the best? Not Catholic. It was just Christian. Who's the best Christian I know? Because I didn't believe in Catholic. I was still mad at the priest for all this, bad stuff, bad publicity. But I didn't really know. I never really looked into it. But the culture kind of raised me in a way, and they were not friendly towards Catholic. So once I put my faith in Jesus first, then people would push back on me like, which church though? Catholic? No. Once they gave me that pushback, I was like, well, my grandfather was Catholic and he was the best man I knew, so he can't be wrong. Let's see. I'm going to take his side. And then that's when I first opened up the catechism, and that was it. That was all she wrote. Catechism plus St. Ignatius. That was it. I didn't need any more than that. Once he said the Catholic Church, you can't find it without the bishop. I mean, it doesn't get cut and dry. I was getting upset with people when I first started. You know how you get. Because once you realize that it's true, like for me, it's for sure true. You want to convince other people because it seems so simple. Because it wasn't just that. It wasn't just. It's not just read the Catechism, read Saint Ignatius, you become a Catholic. That's how it was for me, based on what I had seen, the person that I'd seen. So yours was you were reading, right? You did a lot more study, education. You didn't know like the best Catholic up front. Like I knew somebody that I see as a saint live a whole life, and I'm copying him except for the Catholic part. And you're reading into it, and then you have to go and kind of trust these strangers that you never met. Like, who was the first great Catholic that you met?
yeah, gosh, it was a bit of an eye opener for many of us converts when we are reading about the Catholic faith and then we actually start entering into Catholic churches. But I will say I was very, very fortunate and blessed. I went to a parish that had been in my neighborhood, growing up. And it was, I guess it would have been around 2000, 2001. I had a priest reassigned to this parish, and he ended up staying there for 12 or 13 years. His name is Father James Kaufman, and he's deceased now. May he rest in peace. But he was one of these priests who was very, very just charismatic, and not charismatic in the hands in the air, but just a charismatic personality. Brilliant man, spoke like 6 or 7 languages fluently. And, he was the right priest for me to be inquiring about the faith, right? Where I could have gone some other directions. And, like I said, I was intellectually convinced. Regardless, I probably could have ended up at the notorious clown mass or whatever, that the infamous clown mass, though I'm not for sure they even really exist. But let's just say if I had ended up in the worst kind of parish, I still would have probably become Catholic just because of all of the stuff. I had did my homework at that point. But he was a fantastic person for me. He had a lot of the intellectual answers that I'm looking for, but he was also just very pastorally aware of how to handle people sort of showing up off the streets into his parish. As well, he introduced me. He had turned this parish around. This parish was when he took it over, it was, I think, like financially insolvent. There was not many parishioners left that were like below the age of 65. And when he took it over, he told me that he was doing more last rites than baptisms. And by the 10-year mark, by the decade mark, he had flipped that. There was more baptisms than last rites, because he came in, he wasn't a traditional Latin mass guy, but his interpretation, if you will, of the New Order Mass, of the Roman Mass, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was such that was a huge part of my conversion process, actually, was to enter into this beautiful liturgy that was just so different than anything else I had ever experienced. So he was integral to that. But then he had also hired a new director of religious education, who was a Thomas Aquinas College graduate, as well as a Ave Maria graduate from down in Florida. And this guy was just like right up my lane in terms of every stumbling block question that I had, he had the answers for, on the kind of level where it was like, because they kind of figured out like pretty quickly, like, okay, this guy's kind of done his homework. We need to have like the correct answers for him. But most of my questions were more to satisfy my own intellectual curiosity. It wasn't like to convince me. It was kind of silly things, like looking back in hindsight. But I was super caught up in questions of like predestination and justification and these kinds of things. And now, like, all these years in, I don't really concern myself with a lot of those questions. I'm kind of in a totally different area. But at the time, I was like, man, I need the answers to these. So
Yeah, I got into that deep down that rabbit hole. Just like I know that they're right, but I want to say, like, show your work. I know you have the work. Let me take a look at it. Yeah, it checks out. They have answers for everything from every decade. So this ties into the episode for today perfectly, because you're talking about a living witness that you had. The saints are still alive, although people don't think so. But they finished the race, and who's better than the ones that have actually finished the race? And it's interesting which saints we kind of align ourselves with. And right now, my saint is Augustine. That's the guy that I'm trying to learn about. I bought City of God. I get a page or two in every once in a while, but it's heavy, dense. I've read Confessions. I'm still not done with it, because every time I read it, it points me somewhere crazy. Like, I have to go read this passage, and the way he just ties everything together, I don't know, it really speaks to me. It seems that St. Maximilian Kolbe was that guy for you. And I want to start off every episode. I do a passage that I think is relevant to the episode. So this is the passage that I picked out. It's John chapter 15, verses 12 to 13. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. So the reason I picked this passage is because this is a living faith. This is living it to the highest order, is to lay it down for somebody else, for other. That goes counterintuitive to all our survival instincts. So what do you think about this passage and how it relates to St. Kolbe?
yeah, so with Maximilian Kolbe, I guess for people that may not be familiar with who he is, would it be, I guess, appropriate maybe to
Yeah,
introduce him a little bit?
sure.
So he was born in Poland in 1894. At the time, the region of Poland that he was born into was still a part of Russia. Poland, in particular, was sandwiched between certain national conflicts that were taking place with the emergence of Germany, the German state, and then the Russian nationalism. And then from a very young age, he has a very mystical sense of the world, so much so that at 9, there was he has a personal apparition of Our Lady, and he said that the Mother of God appeared to him, and she offers him 2 crowns, a white crown and a red crown. The white crown being the one of chastity and purity, and the red one being one of martyr. And she said, "Which of these would you accept?" And he accepted both of them. And I think in many ways his life is a reflection of that moment, of that apparition, because you can see what he's most well known for is the event that happens at the end of his life, which is martyrdom in the German death camps of Auschwitz. But his whole life, I think, it's a road and a path that we can look back on and say, okay, he was actually, from that moment that he accepted that crown of Our Lady, he was on that path and that journey towards martyrdom. And I think the theology, which he's not as well known for, as a matter of fact, it's his theology that actually spoke to me more. So I mean, when I first heard about Saint Maximilian, it's like most people, I'd heard about him as the martyr from World War II, and the great heroic witness that he gave. But I had never really considered him as a theologian before. If anything, I think I'd heard people call him just a pious journalist. But once you actually spend some time with his theology, Father Peter Fellner once said that his act at Auschwitz, it was the coming to fruition of this entire life project that he had been involved in with his theological outlook. And so much of what I've been doing with my channel and with my even my personal life in so many ways has been to present this to people. So very much what you were saying. I think that's a very apt passage. We can get into the specifics of his theology if you'd like, or we can get into the specifics of his martyrdom in particular. But I don't think it's just the point I'm trying to make is they're not two separate things. They're very much one thing that's integral to understanding who he was. Like you don't get Saint Maximilian Kolbe, martyr of Auschwitz, without Saint Maximilian Kolbe, theologian.
Absolutely. That's one of the main things. Everybody's looking for that deep down. Practice what you preach. The worst thing is the hypocrite. That's why it's the worst thing for a priest to betray the oath, the promise that they made. Like they are held to the highest standard for a reason. And when they break that standard, you're like, why should I listen to them?
Mm-hmm.
But there is an answer to that. But that's what just the instinct that for me when I was young, that was enough for me. Like, look at these hypocrites. They're going to tell me what to do. No, I can do better. You know. But then once you find people like Saint Maximilian Kolbe who actually they lived it, when you watch them live it and they hold themselves to that standard, I mean, not only do they show that it's possible, but you see how they finish the race, who they are. And wouldn't you want to be like that? At least aim for that.
Yeah, he's somebody that suffered most of his life with tuberculosis. And for most people, that was sort of it's not necessarily your immediate death, but it was the end of any plans that you had in life. Whereas Maximilian Kolbe, much of his writings, much of his journals, you see the intensity of the sickness that and the suffering that he was bearing, while at the same time he's very much involved in an evangelic work, traveling around the world, involved in media and print and these types of things that he probably would have been known for even had his martyrdom never happened. So
Yeah, one of the main things that I learned since coming over to the Catholic side from the last thing that I studied was Stoicism. And their whole thing is, to control your emotions through, difficult times. They talk about if you lose a son or something like that, or if somebody else does, you can't go on wailing about it. You have to, there's a time where you have to go on to the next thing. This is bigger than us. Through Catholicism, Christianity, Jesus, you're transforming that suffering into the highest good. Like that's what Jesus did, the most suffering for the highest amount of good. And we're called to do that. We're called to do that every day. And what does that look like? It looks like different things for different people. But when you see somebody like, Saint Maximilian, he is transforming that suffering in a way that's what God wants. I'm pretty sure, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even before I ended up, I actually have a chronic illness that I deal with, and even before I ended up with that, I started studying the life of Maximilian Kolbe, and in many ways, that was sort of preparation for me in my own terms, because like I said, many of us we have grand plans in life, and then the reality of life hits us pretty hard sometimes. So it's been both a humbling lesson for me, but also it's a real process of realizing, okay, this saint that I have a devotion to and that I venerate, and in many ways, my suffering is not comparable to his. And the reality is, most of us are never going to face the kind of martyrdom situation that he faced. So it gives context for me when I'm kind of like woe is me, feeling sorry for myself for how things turned out. At the same time, there was never a point in his life where any of these things stopped him from the goal that he had set out for from that original apparition.
So what made you go deeper into him? So you heard the highlights about him. What was the doctrine or his theology that really spoke to you?
So he's Maximilian Kolbe was. he's alive at a really interesting time. He's a young man in the 19 teens, and he was a very well trained theologian. Many people don't realize this, but he had studied at the Seraphicum. He had doctorate in philosophy, he had a doctorate in theology. So very, very intelligent man. And I kind of came through to Kolbe in a roundabout way through my study of another wonderful Franciscan who's passed away now, but his name is Father Peter Fellner. And Fellner has this way of in his own theological writings of integrating certain thinkers where certain people will say, oh, well, when you're reading Kolbe, you're reading like a real break from the Franciscan tradition. That's why we don't look at Kolbe's theology. We focus on his martyrdom, but we sort of leave his theology to the side because he was a break with the Franciscan tradition. Whereas Fellner says, no, actually, if you're looking at what's taking place in the context of Kolbe's life and when he's writing, Kolbe has what he calls a golden thread, which is basically this conceptual thread that takes place within the Franciscan order specifically from the time of St. Francis all the way up until the declaration of Our Lady's Immaculate Conception as a dogmatic pronouncement of the faith with, I guess, 18, I would get the year wrong. I don't have it written down. But anyways, the Immaculate Conception was a theological idea that was argued for many centuries. And the Franciscan order was the order excellence that defended this teaching of Our Lady as Immaculate Conception. And so within the Franciscan tradition, they look at theology, and this is kind of touches upon some things that you were just saying a minute ago, but they look at theology in a threefold way. The first way of looking at theology is what they call the symbolic theology, which is basically what the kind of things that Catholics do, right? So the symbolic theology is like the Nicene Creed, which we recite at Mass, right? Which we recite at the liturgy. It's the liturgy itself. It's partaking of the sacraments. It's the sort of foundational things that even symbolic theology, you don't necessarily walk around and think of your average lay Catholic who you may run into who doesn't necessarily spend time reading books as a theologian. But in this Franciscan way of viewing theology, that actually is a form of doing theology, to partake of the sacraments, to partake in the Mass, to recite and believe in the creed. So that's the symbolic theology. Then there's what's called the academic or the proper theology, which is the kind of stuff that we tend to think about, right? That's what the people go to the university and get degrees for, right? The ones that have bookshelves and they're very heady, kind of, they argue about ideas and things. And then there's the third way, which is contemplative theology, and this is the theology of the saints. So you could even have an illiterate saint. I want to say, I think at least early in her life, Saint Bernadette, who was the young peasant girl that had received the apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes. She was an illiterate young girl, but she comes back from her experience at Lourdes with this very deeply significant theological statement, which is Our Lady tells her, I am the Immaculate Conception. And this is a contemplative form of theology, right? Which in fact the Franciscans would say is the highest form of theology. So, even the biggest, headiest, nerdiest kind of like academic theologian that you can think of is nowhere near the richness and fullness of the contemplatives, right? The exemplar for Franciscans is, of course, St. Francis of Assisi himself. Even though you don't necessarily turn to St. Francis for a lot of writings, in fact, there's very little writings that we actually have of St. Francis. He was, in fact, the exemplar of what it is to live out, in many ways, the gospel life, which the faith is a lived faith. So he is a theologian in that sense. As well, the Franciscans teach that the faith is a practical thing. And our theology is actually practical. Our theology, and this is where, going back to my own story, it's not about filling our head with a bunch of information. The faith is actually supposed to be transformative. And it's St. Bonaventure would say that the purpose of the faith is to be made good, is to become good, and principally to become good. So if you're just filling your head with truth, but that truth isn't being converted into actual goodness, then you're not actually living out the fullness of what the faith is actually calling us to do. So all of this is to say that when you get to the time of St. Maximilian Kolbe, he's coming around decades after the Immaculate Conception had been dogmatized as an article of the faith. And so anytime you have something about the faith it enters that symbolic realm of theology, the Franciscan way of looking at it is, well, then now it's the purpose of that thing is to make us holy. So we don't, like I said, we don't just fill our heads up with information. We need to have the things that we teach that are true be transformative. So Maximilian Kolbe is looking back and he's saying, okay, we know now we're no longer just arguing for the Immaculate Conception. As a Catholic, you have to believe this is a truth of the faith. So it's an article of the faith. So now the question is, how do we use the Immaculate Conception to make us holy? And that becomes for him the impetus for forming what he calls the Militia of the Immaculata, which is this idea that, through an act of consecration to Our Lady, we are uniting ourselves in a what he would call a quasi form of incarnation, though that's a controversial statement. It has to be properly understood. I kind of caused some trouble on Twitter one time by bringing this up. But recently I had a really great discussion with two very brilliant men, Charles Anthony and Dr. Jared Goff, who are like experts in the Maximilian Kolbe's theology. And so if you guys are interested, just find that video. It's be way too much for us to get into here. But the idea is that we are so united to Our Lady, who herself, because this is an insight from Maximilian Kolbe. He says, Our Lady at Lourdes doesn't tell St. Bernadette, I was immaculately conceived, which would be like an action. What she says, rather, is I am the Immaculate Conception. And Kolbe sees in this a statement of who the person of Our Lady is. And so as another Marian title that's not dogmatized, but it has quite a bit of significance and weight behind it, and one that Maximilian Kolbe certainly believed in, is Our Lady, Mediatrix of all graces. Have you heard of that one before?
No.
So the idea is that all grace originates from God. There's no, we don't doubt that. But the channel through which grace is mediated out to the world is through Our Lady. Now, the reason that that's possible is because of the incarnation, because of her son. There's no denial of that aspect within. You always have to have these qualifiers, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because we don't want to upset the Protestants, right? But there's no denial of the work that Jesus Christ did. But Our Lady, mediatrix of all graces, means that when grace is meted out, right? Like the grace that you receive, it's in some way channeled through her. So Maximilian Kolbe's idea is, look, you have her, you have Our Lady, the Immaculate Conception, which he ties back into in a certain unique indwelling of the Holy Spirit that takes place with Our Lady, that no other creature has, and no other creature has access to the extent that she has. So by consecrating ourselves to Our Lady, we therefore make these graces accessible in a way that when we're not consecrated to her wouldn't have been as accessible to us. Now, of course, they still are accessible, right? Like we still can receive graces through the sacraments and the normal channels of which grace comes to us. But what he's saying here is that there's a unique moment that's taking place in history. And this is, I'm getting a little long-winded here, so stop me at any point, right? But this is getting to the point at which, if you look at the time that he's alive, right, he forms the Militia Immaculata in 1917. Within months, within the same time frame that he's doing this, the Bolsheviks have seized power in Russia, which is the beginning of this worldwide communist movement, right? It's the first time that the communists have seized power in a state, in a country, and it's this casting of darkness, right? Because what is at the same moment too, I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but at the same moment that all of this is happening in 1917, what else is happening? Our Lady of Fatima, right? And Our Lady of Fatima, what does she tell the three children at Fatima? But that there will be the errors of Russia, which will spread across the world. Well, this is all happening at the same moment, right? And at the same time, Maximilian Kolbe is pondering all of these things. So I think it's a real moment of intervention. I think this is a contemplative move on St. Maximilian's part, where he's able to like be here at this moment in time, anticipate, because nobody knows what's going to, like, nobody could like foresee the formation of the Soviet Union and the worldwide spread of their eras, except three little children in Portugal, right? They were the first ones to receive, but nobody else is thinking about it at this time. Maximilian Kolbe is not even really aware of it, but he is aware of a sort of spreading of what he calls secularism and indifference and a darkness that's spreading in the world. And so, as he's contemplating on this, he's like, "Look, Satan really does seem to be at play and at move here in a unique way. At the same time, Our Lady seems to be making a move as well. The apparition at Lourdes, with the dogmatic pronouncement of the Immaculate Conception. There's something Maximilian Kolbe anticipates that something is happening here. So he comes up with the Militia of the Immaculata, the Knights of the Immaculata, which is a consecration that one can take to unite oneself. Basically, if you think about it, militia, there's a very like militaristic sense in which he's thinking about this, because he's anticipating that there's going to be a worldwide clash between religion and secularism. And I think in many ways the modern world has played out in that direction.
So would you say that's one of the main things that draw you into him is somebody that's calling the spiritual war to the front, to the consciousness, and like we have to deal with this. We can't just put this off because the secular world, that's exactly what they want. Like they laugh at you if you say that evil exists, even in the form of a devil. That just shuts off the conversation. It's evolved into that now, where you can easily just laugh at somebody for calling out spiritual, like there's a spiritual realm, and just scoff at it. Meanwhile, all the stuff we read from the early church, everybody believed in God mostly. There was very few people not in positions of power that had this kind of secular outlook. So I think for sure that's one of the things that drew me back into it was seeing evil. Like if the devil exists, then logically God has to exist. There's not. I don't think there's just the devil. I think there's both or there's none. For a long time, I thought there wasn't either, and I think that's the trick and the trap that secularism, even back from then, that's what it's kind of morphed into. Even though that war's over, there's these different wars, and it's all connected. This one spiritual war. So, is that one of the things that drew you to Saint Colby, or was there something else besides that
No,
part?
that was the primary thing, because I had drank from the secular well, and I still say to this day, there's still a lot of damage that's done to me, that I'm kind of like, I think even before we started this, you had mentioned we kind of have to like deconstruct our secular pasts. Many of us do, right? Because for a lot of us, our parents, our grandparents have sort of shed the religiosity of their ancestors. So we're two, three, some maybe for some places 4 generations in now for some people of just the secular like the secular promise was many different promises, right? I don't think we in the West are free from the errors of secularism, though there was a unique sense in which in Maximilian's time, yes, they were looking at Russia, they were looking at the Soviet Union, but he was also concerned in this country with, or in the West, with the rise of Freemasonry. And Freemasonry, while it may be sort of a relic of the past in the year 2025, secularism itself is not a relic of the past. Here in the West, we very much are dealing and reeling with the consequences of having lived through this. So very much this was a part of what it was for me, because I do think many of us have, like, drank from that secular well. We were promised all of these rewards, and on the tail end of it, it's left most of us high and dry. So when I started the City of the Immaculata, the whole idea was, how do we sanctify even sometimes the more mundane things that we do in this life, right? Like, I don't necessarily see everything I do as being for the building up of the kingdom, but in many ways, because this has only been about a 4 or 5 year experience for me of really coming to love the Franciscan tradition, and and really coming to love the stuff of what Maximilian Kolbe was doing. But in many ways, I feel like he is a representative of what it looks like to sanctify one's life to such an extent that when it came to that moment in Auschwitz, right, he was well poised to step out of that crowd as he did and offer himself up. And I think we should all, we should all be at any given point in our lives so sanctified that any one of us are capable of being a Maximilian Kolbe were that to be called upon us. And again, I don't think most of us are not going to be called to that level of martyrdom, but there's Catholics and Christians in general, but Catholics are the ones I'm primarily concerned with. We're kind of in a bad way, in my opinion, in many respects, and there's a lot of work to be done. And I think a huge part of that work is actually sanctifying. I think far too many Catholics are way more secular than they realize, and they have, in many ways, kind of reduced. And I'm not trying to like trash Catholics with this lecture, but in many ways, there's been a reduction of the mystical and contemplative elements of the faith that I think has been a real tragedy, and we're impoverished here in the year 2025 of our Lord by this impoverishment. Whereas I think a turn to the sanctification through consecration that Kolbe talks about, well, it's not a panacea. It's not going to cure all of our problems. I think it would push many of us in the right direction if we're people to begin approaching the faith in that kind of way.
I couldn't agree more. This is why I started this podcast, and this podcast is dedicated to the Knights of Columbus, which I joined last year. And late 1800s, they came out too, and it is a fight. And these guys are still around. They're old. Sometimes it looks bad, the numbers, but you got a guy like me. I'm a young guy. I'm trying to get more young guys out there, as young as possible, that are allowed to go. Like, let's keep going. It's not done after you get confirmed, because I got confirmed and then I was done. I did what I needed to. They told me to do this. I did it. Now it's on me. And I went down the wrong way. But if I can help somebody else, a young kid, maybe it's through jiu-jitsu, because they are linked. Everything's linked. How you act in this world is linked, whether it's playing sports, whether it's your job that you do, or whether it's how you raise children, how you interact with the community. And the Knights, that's directly what they're about: charity, unity, fraternity. That's what we're going for. So that's what I'm not saying that's the only way. I'm saying my priest told me I should do that, and I'm doing it. And there are fruits from it, because if there aren't fruits, then it's not the real tree. That's a fake tree. And the fact that you're still as into what you're doing as you are, it shows that there's fruits of it. It's an bottomless well. It's where do you want to go? You can't know everything. It's impossible to know everything. So you pick saints. The saints call to you. That's what I think. I think St. Augustine called to me and said, you have to come read my story, and you have to interact in this way. And people in my life pointed me. Like, once I started reading St. Thomas first. And the way that I talk to the people in my community, my parish, they said, you should read St. Augustine. And they were right. There's a reason why they tell you should go that way. The saints point you through other people, through Mary. I keep talking to people on this podcast, and Mary it's just consistent how powerful she is. The rosary, the consecration, and there's been real fruits. And I know people now that have gone through it, and I know myself that I've gone through it. And I've been trying to pay more attention to Mary and try to do better in that way. So what do you have to say about the Knights of Columbus, and what do you know about them? What's your connection with them?
I don't know as much as I probably should. The one thing I will say, especially as it relates, kind of tying the stuff back in with Kolbe, he had a deep concern for, as we talked about, the not just the rise of secularism, but how it was expressing himself. He was a young man still, I think, going for his degree in Rome. And the story is that he's looking out the window one day, and there was a parade taking place in the streets of Rome. And it was a parade of Freemasons. And their banners that they were holding were these like satanic banners, which was calling for the overthrow of the Pope. I want to say one of the images on the banners was of, like, the classic image of Saint Michael defeating the dragon. Well, this was an inversion of that. It was like Satan with a spear killing the Pope in this banner. So he was deeply affected by that, and it really came to like a complete and total distrust and, I would say, near hatred of the Freemasons as an organization, not individual Freemasons, right? But as an organization. And I know that the Knights of Columbus was founded as a response to an interest in Catholics at the time of sort of, especially Catholic men, gaining entrance into these sort of secret societies. And, with what was coming out from Rome, clearly at first hesitant, but then some final, like, actual condemnations of Freemasonry And I think it's, you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's actually an act of excommunication if you join the Freemasons as a Catholic. You've pretty much excommunicated yourself from the church. So, who was remind me again of the founder?
I said Father McGivney.
Yes. And so he wanted to offer Catholics in the United States something that was an alternative, because there's nothing wrong, right? Like Catholics have always had like fraternal organizations, but there's a specifically diabolical element to the Freemasons that is not prevalent in the nature of fraternal organizations as a whole. So yeah, that's what I know about them, and I do believe. I've never actually read. I don't know if Maximilian Kolbe was aware of the Knights of Columbus, but I know he would have been wholly supportive of it due to the fact that it was a potentially sanctifying alternative to Catholics joining Freemasons, which they were doing in the 19th century.
Oh wow. So I got this here. 1983 Code of Canon Law. A person who joins an association which plots against the church is to be punished with a just penalty. One who promotes or takes office in such an association is to be punished with an interdict.
Interdict, okay.
What's it? I
Ban,
never.
they're banned from the sacraments, basically.
Okay, I never even heard that word. Interdict. Yeah, yeah. They are a response to him, and it's not a secret. Like you're supposed to live your life in public, and you don't have these secret whatever. Jesus isn't his message isn't a secret. That goes against the whole thing. Like he laid out his message, and we're here to promote and support the church. That's the goal.
Yeah, so I think he would have, and I'm just again, I'm looking at it through the lens of Colby, but I think he would have been wholly supportive of an organization like that, especially with the charitable work that the Knights do. Again, you're taking something that was otherwise, these sort of mundane tasks, and you're turning them into sanctifying acts that make the person holy. Which we men, we need all that we can get, right? Like we need all the help that we can get because I'm sure you, as somebody who's trained in martial arts, is well aware of. Guys have a tendency to just want to be lazy, right? We want to have a tendency to want to veg. So it takes more than I think just an act of one's own willpower to move us to the sort of great acts that men are actually capable of doing. But that's the quickest, fastest, cheapest way for us to do that is through the channel of grace. And when the Knights of Columbus are at their best, my Irish. I consider him. It's my mother's stepfather, but he was Irish, and he was one of the few that I know was Catholic from my childhood. Though we never really discussed it, but I remember him saying when I was a young man and I didn't know what the Knights of Columbus really were, but I remember him telling me about the Knights of Columbus, and he said, "Well, all they ever really do was drink scotch, play poker, and smoke cigars." And so I kind of had that image in my mind. But then when I went through RCIA, a couple of the guys that were teaching RCIA were members of the Knights of Columbus, and these guys, man, were outstanding. They were involved in like more charities than I thought there was hours in the day to have time to be involved with. So I think the old, and again, that might have been true somewhat of my grandfather's generation. Maybe he was being a little cynical. I don't know. Maybe that was true of that generation. I don't know. But I would say the guys that are coming up now, all the ones that I've seen have been really solid.
Yeah, I mean it's like the Catholic Church. 70% of the people don't think that it's the real Eucharist, the real body and blood of Christ. So
Yeah.
sometimes the numbers aren't in your favor. That doesn't mean they're right. And yes, some of the best guys I ever met were Knights of Columbus and are Knights of Columbus. And yeah, if you get the little stuff right, like hey, the deck at the church is kind of rickety. Why don't we sturdy it up and paint it? All the way to hey, can we support these seminarians with money financially so they can make it through? Hey, we're going to this abortion march. We don't think this is right. And we're going to stand up for it publicly and say, no, this is wrong. They go from small to big. So if you can't do the small stuff right, how are you going to do the big stuff right? And they've been, doing it for over 100 years. And it's hard to see against it. I mean, I've only been part of it 6 months, but the people that I've met so far if I was around those people for, the early part of my adulthood and I had their witness to help guide me, I would have been back sooner. So that's what I'm trying to do. I want to be a good witness like these guys. They've already lived it out. 40 plus, the average Knight of Columbus is 70 years old. So they got a lot of years ahead of me. And there's a lot that you can learn from people that are still alive. They don't have to be dead saints to learn from them. Like people that you know up close and that, like I always love mentors. That's what jiu-jitsu, I wouldn't be a black belt without thousands of people's help from people that are white belts who are worse than me, people that are way, way better than me. I've worked out with world champions that have been at the highest level and the lowest level. And same thing with Catholics. Yes, there's somebody that doesn't need to know every word of it. They don't need to know any of the words of it. If they act out the sacraments correctly, and when push comes to shove, they don't turn their back on Jesus, that's the person that you want to be around. And then it'll help you not turn your back on Jesus, because we could all do it. I've done it. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. It's one of the worst decisions. It is the worst decision I ever made, is to turn my back on him. But now we're back. We got to, the prodigal son's my favorite story because we're back. And Jesus, they with open arms, he'll come. You won't even get to the door, and he's already accepted you back. So now it's time to pay it forward.
Yeah, and I found a lot of these younger guys, man. Like I don't know, I'm sure, being in the gym, you would probably run into this yourself, man. But I find a lot of the young guys get flack out there, and I admit it is kind of tough. But a lot of these guys that I've met, man, are really hungry for like something solid, and they're just looking for that, like you said, man. They're like a good mentor. That was a life changing. It was actually a martial arts coach for me. Life changing experience for me to have that kind of mentorship, and I do think that that's a real problem that we're facing because even I mean, I wish them a quick demise, but even the Freemasons numbers are not good. Like these sort of fraternal organizations that like men have relied upon to sort of buttress each other up, like one by one, they're starting to collapse all over the place. And I'm a little concerned about that for like men in general. So at the Knights of Columbus, man, if you guys can like hold the fort, right, and hold the base and offer something for these younger guys, because I think that is a huge part, man. Like I was involved in building science for many years, and there was a huge problem with the older guys not passing on. Like they talk now, like in the construction business, how there's a real gap between like the guys that are retiring out and nobody's coming in. And I was like, look, man, you guys weren't teaching the young guys, right? You kind of like kept the poker cards close to your chest, man, and never shared anything. And a lot of these younger guys, man, they're just kind of moving on to other stuff now. So there's so many different areas where I think that young men need that kind of mentorship and that guidance that they could get from a solid group of guys like the Knights of Columbus. You got to have the guys enroll, right? The guys got to be willing. The young guys got to be willing to roll, but then the older guys got to be willing to step up to the plate and be that good mentor. So
I agree with you. It's not just in Knights of Columbus, not just the church. It's in all the different trades that take experiential skill. There's certain things like I'm a firefighter. You can't learn firefighting if you don't actually fight fire. Like that's part of it. You could read all the books and the mentors could tell you all the stories, their war stories, until you're in front of the building and it's on fire and it's you that's in charge. It doesn't count. And that's kind of what Catholicism is too. You're not really practicing Catholic unless you're going to the church. That's one of the things I learned early when I started arguing with people that these Protestants that say, yeah, the church is everywhere. I go to church all the time in their mind. And that's one of the things I've seen up close in other aspects of my life where that's not true. Like jiu-jitsu will not let you can't live that out because we're going to roll. As soon as you roll, I'll know if you did your homework or not. And that's one of the things I like best about it. And same thing with Catholicism. We know if we're practicing Catholics or not based on the way we talk to each other. Do you have the creed memorized? Then you're not really practicing. I didn't have it memorized for a long time because I wasn't really practicing. I was going through the motions Catholic for most of my life until I turned away from it. And that's why I turned away from it, because I was just going through the motions. So if we can not, and another thing with the different generations, we have a hard time communicating because stuff like this, the internet, phones, the access to information it's so easy now to get some kind of information. Doesn't mean it's right, but you're going to have it fast and you're going to have a lot of it. And we lost that kind of communication in this way where we have to get it back. We need to get the older generations to talk to the younger generations more. I think that's endless. It's throughout time. Throughout history, it's always been, you're just old, whatever. That's how they used to do it. Now this is how we do it. And it's always been this battle. And maybe we're losing it a little more than we used to. But I think this is one of the ways where we can connect. I think podcasting is just the best thing ever. It's just a one-to-one. Like I can directly shoot my thoughts into your brain. Now, whether you like them or not, that's up to you. But that's the game that we're trying to play. And we're trying to do what we think are the best thoughts. I think it's the catechism in the Bible. And there's got to be a way we could make that interesting to show people how to act that out in your life. And it is with the little stuff, like helping the church put their deck together. It's just little things like that.
Yeah, that's definitely the key is the actually getting people to act. Because then again, I mean, this was me, man. I spent probably 10 years or not more I get my years confused at this point, but just reading and learning. And I was like, well, I thought that's all I needed to do. But it's like, no, I wasn't really until I was a good ways in before it actually became a transformative thing for me. Right. And I think that's, as I guess circling all the way back to the beginning, we were talking about like content creation. The best things I think that any of us could do as far as content creation goes is to make saints, right? And if we can make saints of people, man, then we're doing our jobs. If we're just filling people full of information, then we're not doing it, man. Right? We need to make saints, and I think that's what counts.
Exactly right. Okay, so we're gonna close this up. Any last things that you want to leave for the listener, if they can just know one thing about Kolbe to take away from this episode?
Yeah. So we didn't really go too much. Surprisingly, didn't go too much into his martyrdom, but there was just quickly. Kolbe was arrested in what I think 1939, put into the Auschwitz, the notorious death camps, and there was a prisoner that escaped, and the really sadistic SS guard there says, "Well, I'm going to take 10 men from that bunker, 10 men at random, and we're going to put you in a cell and starve you to death because one of you escaped." And when he's calling names out at random, he picks this one guy, this poor guy. You could just imagine, man. This guy breaks down. He's like, "Look, I got a wife, I got a kids." He's like in tears. And then out of that crowd, Maximilian Kolbe steps out and says, "I'll take his place." And the commander says, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "I'm a Catholic priest." And I think that those are words, especially if you have any priests watching, right? Those are words that like resonate down to our own day. But Maximilian Kolbe, man, he'd never met that guy before in his life. He's just a random guy, right? A guy you pass out on pass on the streets. Would you lay your life down for some? I mean, the guy could have been a complete and total jerk, right? You don't know. He steps forward and offers himself in place for this person it seems like without giving it a second thought. And again, that was not out of context to the rest of this man's life. And the thing about this Franciscan tradition that I absolutely love is that it is about making the faith a lived thing, so that were we to ever find ourselves, God forbid, in a situation like that, we would be the ones to step out of the crowd and take this person's place. And that happens. That doesn't happen on accident, right? That happens by the means that the church offers us through the ability for us to become holy through the grace of the sacraments.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, of course, we only scratched the surface on who Saint Kolbe was. Is there a video or a series that you would recommend highest for somebody just starting out who wants to go deeper on him?
Gosh, I guess if you want to do a real deep dive for Kolbe's theology now, there's a YouTube channel called the Franciscan Friars, and they did a presentation once on Father Peter Fellner's work called, it's a book that he wrote called The Theologian of Auschwitz. It's like a 14, 15 long series, like 2 hours each lecture that they do. So it's pretty long, it's pretty intense. But even if people just spend a little bit of time with some of that stuff, there's a lot of preliminary videos at the beginning. If you want the meat, it's sort of like in the middle. Now, don't get me wrong, right? The preliminary stuff is important, right? Because it sort of sets the foundation. But that's about as exhaustive as you can get on just a little bit more of like a practical level. Unfortunately, I don't follow as much of the content as I should out there, but the guy that presents the stuff, it's like he's who he is, the image of him is right in my mind, but I can't think of his name off the top of my head. But we could probably, I'll send it, if I find it, I'll send it into the description. You
Yeah,
can
no
leave it in the
problem.
description. His stuff is much more introductory, and then a little bit more too into the holy witness of Maximilian as a martyr as well. So
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot there.
no problem, no problem.
Okay, anywhere you want to plug before I'm going to take us out with a prayer at the end. Just let people know where they can find you and what you got going on.
Yeah, so I'm at City of the Immaculata. Most of my stuff right now is on YouTube. I'll be changing up a few things in the future, but we'll leave the anticipation of that for where it is for right now. And I've also got some works that I'm going to be looking to publish in the near future. But for now, you can just find me on YouTube. That's a pretty good place to find me.
Perfect. And definitely go check him out because he said he's going to have me on for an episode, and that should be fun. We're going to be talking about jiu-jitsu and how it relates to the Catholic Church. It might just be a lot of jiu-jitsu talk.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Okay, so I'm going to say us out with a prayer here. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the life and witness of Saint Maximilian Kolbe, who showed us the depth of true love by laying down his life for another. Inspired by his devotion to the Immaculate Conception and his fearless evangelization, may we too embrace our mission with courage and humility. Teach us to love as Christ commanded, to give ourselves selflessly, and to use the gifts you have given us to spread your truth in a world in need of hope. Strengthen the men of the Church, especially the Knights of Columbus, to follow Kolbe's example in faith, fraternity, and sacrifice. May his intercession guide us always as we seek to serve you with undivided hearts. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Brian, I'd just like to thank you so much for coming on here with me, sharing your story, and teaching us a little bit about St. Maximilian Kolbe. Any final words you have?
Thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you, Lord, for giving me the courage and the strength to carry on. Don't you know my life has been a book for you? Reading all the chapters suicide, making mistakes my whole life through. I just want to thank you, Lord, for forgiving me my iniquities of my own. Don't you know I hate it when I go